So first of all, we're going to just a very quick whistle-stop tour around the law, around risk assessments, some terminology and definitions, because we speak in certain terms in health and safety, and that helps you with your process of identifying as much as you can. We'll look at accidents, incidents, and near misses, and the difference between those as well, and the importance of understanding how they happen. Hazard spotting and risk categories. Again, that helps you identify more things in your workplace, and then the actual principles of risk assessments, how to apply it, and there is a specific order that you do that in. Is everyone on mute? Can we just check? We've just got some feedback there, I think. If we can, and then looking at applying suitable controls once you've identified what your hazards and risks are. So, Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act sits above everything else. That's an act of Parliament, so it comes into criminality, and you know, can be prosecuted by judge and jury or magistrate. And there's one line in this act that really summarises an employer's duty, and it's this: every employer must ensure, so far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety and welfare of all employees. So reasonably practicable means that you've done everything that you can, everything, and certainly the foreseeable risks. And there was a report done many, many years ago by Lord Young, and he says that it must be obvious to the next man who gets off the number 30 bus. So obvious to a layperson what's in place. If you can do that, then you're going to prove due diligence, that you've done all that is reasonably practicable. What I will say, and where people fall down frequently, is they've got nothing on record. And UK law is quite simple in this, you know, here. If you can't prove it, you didn't do it. Alan, could you just, oh, I'll mute you, just because I'm getting a little bit of feedback, I think. So due diligence is really important, and being able to prove that in court. So record as much as you can and get into the habit of doing that. Underneath the Health and Safety at Work Act are lots and lots of regulations, and you can almost say there's a regulation for everything that you do in the workplace. I'm not going to go through all those, but then this, the management of health and safety at work is the one that specifies that you must carry out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment. And it must be reviewed regularly. And I would suggest with the COVID-19, that's going to be daily, because the guidelines are changing daily, hopefully relaxing more. But so you will need to change what you originally set out to do. Let me just explain the reasonably practicable balance then in more detail, and what your thought process should be. So it is a balance, and it's a not at all costs that you put things in place, but you must be able to demonstrate that you've gone through this process. So on the one side of that balance, you're looking at, what are we asking people to do? What is the severity of harm that's likely to happen? So in the case of COVID-19, then we're looking at potential fatality and certainly ill health. You look at the likelihood, how likely is it with what we've got in place that that will happen? And then you look at the numbers of people. So if you look at some of the controls that the government's put in around restricting movement of people, restricting the numbers of people that can be together, that's one of the controls that they've got in place. So you start with that side of it, and then you see where you are on a level, and I'll show you that in a second. And then you have to ask yourself, how much cost, time, effort and materials do I need to put to that level of harm to be able to reduce the risk even further? So you're not expected to go out and spend, I don't know, £30,000 to £40,000 on a machine to do a job that's perhaps only going to be done once a month. However, if it's a job that involves, let's say, machinery that can chop hands off and it's in daily use, you better have the best machinery with the best controls in place, because the likelihood will go up because of the use. Does that make sense? Thumbs up. Hopefully. Yeah, Good. And that's all about reduction of risk, getting it to as low as it possibly can. It's very, very rare that you can remove all risk. So we're always left with what we call a residual risk. And in particular, where there's humans involved, because humans can choose to do something different to what you've asked them to do. So what we use, and these can go, for engineering, these can go to a sort of 25 by 25. But this is how you assess what level of risk you're at. So on the top line, and we always start with the top line, the severity. What's the worst that can happen? So if it's, when we're talking about COVID, we're going to be in a 5. I'll use my mouse. We're going to always be in a 5. There's the potential for a fatality for somebody. But then with everything that you do and the controls that you put in, you can affect that likelihood. And obviously what you want to be is at very unlikely or unlikely. Generally, I think where we've got the general public involved, it still may happen. So you're at a 15. And if you go to 15, you might say risk not adequately controlled, additional control measures required to reduce risk. So this matrix is really helpful to guide people what more they can do, because you really want to be in the sort of moderate or the tolerable. Ideally, you want to be in the green, and different things will go into the green. So that's the risk assessment matrix that we use. There's 3 reasons why we manage health and safety. Morally, legally, and economic or financial. Morally, because it's the right thing to do to keep people safe, whether they work for you or they're coming to your premises. And it's good for business. Legally, because you're complying with the law. And then obviously from an economic and financial point of view, if you're not having any accidents or serious incidents, that's going to save you an awful lot of money. Managing health and safety is money well spent, because the costs on the reverse side are astronomical. And the fine system now is based on an up to, well, there is no maximum, but generally the guidelines up to 20% of your turnover and profitability can be issued in fines for companies. So we went from seeing perhaps a couple of £100,000 fines for some of the big companies for serious problems to millions and hundreds of thousands of pounds. So it's really makes good economic sense to manage health and safety. Some definitions that you must know and must understand. I don't know if you want to take notes, because you might need them later when I ask questions. So the first one, definition of a hazard, because that's what we want to do, identify the hazards. And that is something with the potential to cause harm. So it hasn't done yet, but it's got the potential to. So it could be something like a trailing wire. It could be sharp corners. It could be things hanging down, shelves, corners of shelves. They're all hazards. Then we look at risk. So the risk is the likelihood that harm will occur, the degree of harm, and the numbers affected. So what I just showed you with the balance. So we take those things into account to decide on risk. And a risk assessment then is just a process of identifying the hazards and ideally removing the risk completely or reducing it to an acceptable level. That should be the end result of a risk assessment. And you'll see later on that there's certain columns that must be in a risk assessment. So a control measure then that we want to introduce once we've identified hazards and assessed the risk is something that removes or reduces a risk. So I talk in these terms of hazards, risks, risk assessments, and control measures. So I think it was prudent to put that in so you understand the sort of tech speak. Accident then, just to define what an accident is, an unplanned and uncontrolled event leading to harm, injury, or ill health. In other words, something happened, somebody got harmed. And people struggle with identifying the difference between an accident and a near miss. And it generally, in a training situation, takes quite a while for people to be able to give me examples of a near miss. So a near miss is where something happened, but nobody got injured. There was no property damage, nobody got hurt, but they nearly did. And if near misses are ignored, eventually accidents will happen. And if they're continuously ignored, you end up with a serious accident. So near miss reporting is absolutely critical, whether it's scribbling notes in a book that you have on a desk, or for everybody to write in what nearly happened. Because if you're not capturing the near misses, you can't investigate what went wrong. And quite often near misses are the easiest things to solve in seconds. Well, we'll reroute that wire around the outskirts of the room rather than across the middle of it. Yeah. So I think the near misses reporting is really important. And then competent person. So people undertaking risk assessments must have appropriate skills, knowledge and experience to deal with the particular circumstances. So you all know your business, but to be able to carry out a risk assessment, you definitely do need this background to be able to put things into a logical order to be able to capture as much as you can. Has everybody heard of RIDDOR? Hopefully, hands up. RIDDOR, it comes into this COVID side, and the HSE have made it very clear when we talk about, thank you Tony for the thumbs up, when we talk about COVID-19, this is where the near misses come into their own, and near misses should be reported with regard to COVID, serious near misses. So and perhaps what we might class as an accident. So for example, we've had people coughing in other people's faces. That would be a reportable incident, and in particular if that person who got coughed at had to leave work and they were off for more than 7 days. So RIDDOR stands for Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences Regulation. So injuries, physical injuries, accidents, broken bones, bumps, bruises, only certain things. Not going to go into it in any more detail than that. If anybody wants me to send the legislation out, you can do. It's about 4 pages of what you need to report. Diseases, COVID comes into this now, but it also includes things like eczema, dermatitis, things that are caused through the workplace. So we're only interested in things that are caused through the workplace. So if somebody leaves your premises with suspected symptoms of COVID-19, then that would be reportable from a worker's point of view. I might just clarify that later on. And then dangerous occurrences, we're talking about gas leaks, explosions, chemical incidents. Just let me, right, sorry, I was just looking at the chat side. So okay with that. Worth remembering in the back of your mind, because it's a if you don't report certain incidences, then that's against the law as well, and you can be prosecuted under RIDDOR. So you don't want to add to that, really. Okay, so whistle stop tour, most common causes of accidents and ill health, and the HSE publish these every year. They don't change around much, and it's the top 5 generally that you're interested in, because these will identify you to look around your premises and make sure you've captured what you can capture. So top 1 is usually handling, lifting and carrying. So people, I think it's about 22% of all reported accidents are down to handling, lifting and carrying. So that's a massive percentage. Slips and trips comes into it as well. Struck by vehicle, so where there's contact with people with vehicle. So that's an area to look at, because that's going to be potentially a catastrophic event, because it's never going to be a light tap, is it? Fall from height, so people working at height, and it doesn't have to be a great height for people to fall and be injured and be off. Hit by falling objects, so things falling off shelves, off roofs, just generally collapse of racking, that could be. Harmful substances, so chemicals, people dealing with chemicals. It could be inhalation of fumes as well that have made people go off ill. Machinery, so moving machinery or struck by machinery. Sharp objects mentioned before, and that could be relevant to the healthcare sector, but also certainly manufacturing and engineering have a lot of sharp objects. And if you think in hospitality with broken glass, that type of thing. Horseplay, so people messing around. And these are all reported incidents, so people are actually reporting that the root cause was horseplay. Noise is a problem. Stress, of course, is in there. And not following instructions. And they're in order. So again, like I say, the first few you definitely need to pay attention because they are the most common ones. And then, of course, we've got COVID now, which I suspect is at the top now. We don't know numbers-wise how many of the people that have contracted COVID, not necessarily died from it, but contracted COVID, have contracted it at work. We haven't got those figures yet, but it is there in the background, and those sort of level of detail I think we will find out about. So moving on then, and this is all around building up your knowledge of identifying hazards. We think when we're assessing risk, we think in certain factors, and I mentioned these the other day for those that were on that one. There's 4 that we look at. So occupational, environmental, organisational, and human. So occupational, what is the job that people are doing? So how much risk are they at because of the job that they're doing? So if you're asking people to work face-to-face at the moment from a COVID point of view, then that's not good. Environmental, we're looking at the place where we work. Human will come into an organisational. So just explore those a little bit more. And again, I'm being quite general about this because I want to open the gateway for you to think more than COVID-19, although that's a major factor, but I don't want you to miss other details. So if you look at this guy here, he's using a nail gun. That's an occupational hazard all day long. So you have to think, what are we asking people to do? So things like manual handling, if they're lifting and carrying all day, that's a problem. Hazardous substances, what kind of equipment and machinery they're using, contact with vehicles, whether they're lorry drivers or delivery drivers, or just offloading, working in yards, and of course working at height would be an occupational hazard. Environmental factors, this is about the place and the area that we work in. So when you're trying to identify hazards, you think about floors, have we got uneven floors? Have we got slopes? Have we got damaged floors? Entry and exit routes, are there enough? Are they overcrowded? And I think that in particular comes into COVID-19 at the moment and opening up. From a noise point of view, noise has to be assessed separately if it's believed to be a problem. How much space people have got to work in and move around, again, that comes into the COVID controls now. Lighting, temperature, dust and particles, so air quality and ventilation, whether you can provide fresh air ventilation, which is always preferred, or you're using mechanical ventilation. So those come under environmental factors. Of course, COVID-19 comes into that, doesn't it? Environmental factors, as I've said, in a few areas, so bear that in mind. Human factors then. What affects human factors? Lack of knowledge, people don't understand what the problem is. Could be lack of concentration because people are tired, they're stressed, they don't understand. Horseplay, people messing around, people think it's a joke. We see that in many situations because they fail to recognise a problem. And then lack of capability. And that's not necessarily because somebody hasn't got the level of intelligence that they need. It could be because they didn't understand what was asked of them. It could be because it wasn't explained in a way that they understand. And I come across that quite a bit. You have to understand how people learn. And a lot of people learn by doing or by being shown and then asking to sort of demonstrate. So human factors that cause accidents, it's not necessarily their fault. So it's not a question of people not doing as they were told. They probably didn't understand what they were told. So it's worth observing and asking questions back to just make sure that people understand things. COVID again comes into that. making sure everyone understands the potential severity of the problem. Organisational factors, so how the place is operated, what's the culture of the place, the way we work in this place, and how it's managed. So it could be the pace of work, how quickly are we asking people to work, are activities supervised so that people, if anybody's doing anything that's not quite right, it's nipped in the bud? Or are we going to hear, well, I've been doing it like that for 10 years, nobody said anything? So supervision's really important. The demands made on the workers, whether it's a pace of work or whether it's just too much for people. And then, of course, the whole culture of the workplace. And that can come into, your reporting procedure. Is anybody doing anything about it? The staff are reporting things, but are they doing anything about it? That does affect the culture of the workplace seriously, if the management aren't doing their bit, especially. So organisational factors. And then we also think in these terms, again, making note of these will help you capture different things. So biological hazards, so bacteria, molds, diseases. I mentioned Legionella in both other sessions that I did. Is a real risk at the moment for places that have been empty and locked up, because it's a high risk that there will be Legionella in the pipework somewhere or in tanks of water, because we've had the perfect temperatures for it, between 20 and 40, 42 degrees centigrade. And of course, diseases, we're looking at COVID. Chemicals, think in terms of chemicals, what can do harm, whether it's exhaust fumes and vehicles coming into a place, or it's toxic chemicals that you're asking people to use, or corrosive chemicals. Exposure to fumes, I think, might be a problem at the moment, because people are cleaning, and if they're in an enclosed space, what we call the housekeeping syndrome. So the housekeeper goes into the hotel room bathroom, puts bleach around the toilet while she cleans the bath with another chemical. Then she goes to the sink, and the next thing you know, there's all these fumes in the air, and she passes out. It's a common occurrence. So thinking about fumes as well, and ventilation. Physical, vibration, noise, musculoskeletal diseases or disorders. If we're asking people to move furniture and make more space for things, people can, that might be a problem as well. Psychological, stress, abuse, bullying. I think this definitely needs some thought, because I mentioned in the last session, the people that are coming back to work need to be happy to come back to work and comfortable to come back to work. Otherwise, they're going to be definitely stressed. They're going to be anxious. There might also creep in that element of just get on with it. Just get on with it. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. And in particular with the young people who think they're invincible as well. So that's something to be mindful of with your risk assessments. Mechanical, thinking about moving parts, objects and vehicles. So with those headings, again, you can capture a lot more hazards, so you'll be able to control the risks. Officially, there's only one way to do a risk assessment, and I haven't made this up. This is the HSE's guidance, and it works. And with everything else that I've said, ideally, you'll be able to capture what you need to. So the first thing you have to do is identify the hazards. So all those things that I've just said, those different categories, you can also do it by task to identify hazards. You can do it by area. So somebody working in that area, what hazards are they exposed to? There's different ways of identifying hazards. At the very least, you have to identify the obvious, which is that list that I said before that starts with manual handling. Then you decide who might be harmed and how. So you will have a whole list of different categories of people. So employees, customers. Your employees can be split down into different categories. You might have people with disabilities, whether that's physical or psychological. It might be somebody who's hard of hearing. You need to identify these people. From your customer's point of view, it might be the older people, infirm, people with disabilities, people with psychological problems, children, teenagers. We separate children from teenagers because they have different thought processes. We separate babies from toddlers because toddlers can run fast. So the who is really important. You would also take into account, to capture everyone, delivery drivers, the postman. If it's in a care setting, let's say, for example, casual visitors, it could be the doctor, because they're unfamiliar with your site. So if you're doing those 1 and 2, you're more likely to be able to put the right controls in place. If you don't do 2, 1 won't be comprehensive enough. So I hope that's helpful. Then once you've done that, you evaluate the risk, going back to the beginning. Where are we now? What have we already got in place? Are we happy with that? What does the matrix say? No, we need to improve. So you decide on what further precautions you need to put in. Record the findings. So risk assessments need to be written down in a comprehensive way, and I'll just show you my example later. Focus on the controls, because those controls will create your safe system of work. So this is our way of working safely. So when you're recording the findings, don't need to be massive paragraphs. And you'll see in mine, it's simple sentences, because the staff have a right to access and need to know the contents of the risk assessment. So if it's overcomplicated, people aren't interested. They don't want to read reams and reams. So it needs just to be in simple bullet point format that anybody and everybody can understand. So you're focusing on the controls. What are you doing about the hazards that you've identified to the various people? And then lastly, review and update the assessment as necessary. So there's many occasions you'd need to review and update the risk assessment. Could be a new starter. If whatever you had in place beforehand, if you had risk assessments in the first place, then going back to work and opening up is a reason to review. It could be change of staff. You're going to change the layout of your place probably. Go back to the risk assessment. So there's lots of different reasons. Changing legislation, which we've got now. We've got brand new legislation in place. Lots of reasons to review and update the risk assessment. Under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Act, you're obliged to do what we call specific risk assessments. So you can do a general risk assessment that takes in all those things that I said that started with manual handling and lifting and carrying. They're a general risk assessment. Then you need to do specific risk assessment. So let's say you're a busy bar playing music, you definitely have to do a specific noise risk assessment. If you've got people lifting and carrying for a job, you need to do a manual handling risk assessment and just have a look at what is the task that they're doing, and that will take into the frequency. So these will have different formats as well. If you've got young people, so young people still under the age of 18 working for you, they need their own risk assessment. Pregnant women, of course, vibration, people using tools or repetitive jobs, and lone workers as well. So those people that are still working at home should have had a specific risk assessment carried out with them. So you've got generic risk assessments, your sort of catch-all, standard stuff. Then you've got these specific risk assessments. Anything over and above that where the level of risk is high, and let's say life critical, you would want people need to be doing dynamic risk assessments. There's also method statements you can put in, and they are a specific way of doing a job. So you're going that step further in controlling hazards. And then permits to work, a lot more detail in a permit to work, and only generally seen in very high risk environments. So people working at serious heights, people working in confined spaces as well, that might come into it. There's a lot more controls. Not going to go into that too much today. Hierarchy of control measures, again, set out for you by the HSE as a way, again, of making sure that you've thought of everything. And there will be usually several controls put in place to control a risk. Very rarely is it one, other than don't do it. So the first thing we always have to consider to reduce risk is to avoid it. So you can do that by, it could be individuals not allowed to touch something, no access. So I would say things like electrical cupboards. Nobody's going to have a problem because it's locked. So there's no access to it. It could be chemicals. Chemicals are kept locked away and only used by specifically trained people. So there are various ways of avoiding risk by elimination. If you've got, if we go into sort of COSH with hazardous substances, a particular hazardous substance that is corrosive, it's toxic, then I would want that off site. So it's gone. So that risk is gone. Then we look at, if you can't avoid risk, then we look at substituting. So machinery, can we get something safer that's now on the market? Substances, so you're substituting substances. A lot of substances have changed. A lot of, if we think back to lead-based paint, it's very hard to find that except for specialist places at the moment. Most paints are water-based now. So that substitution takes place. And again, with equipment, you know, if equipment's old, it might not be as effective. It might be causing vibration problems. So if you can substitute equipment, then do that. That's one form of control. Then we look at engineering controls. So let's say for noise, for example, isolate, enclose, or separate. And this also comes into the COVID, doesn't it? Separating people, isolating people behind screens, enclosing them so that you've got some level of control rather than none. Automation and mechanization. So if you can get a machine to do it, rather than somebody being involved in it. And I would, from a COVID and a customer service point of view, you might look at the cashless cards system. You know, there's no contact needed between the customer and your employee. So that comes into it. What have you got that you can use to control hazards? Then we look at design, the design of the place. You know, how are you going to move your furniture around so that it's still safe and it makes sense, and you can control in the flow of people. So thinking about your layout, the barriers that you might need to be in place, any guarding. So that could be your ropes or tape across places, and ventilation, of course, we think about that. And reduce time exposure. So from a staff point of view, you might want to introduce short rotas. So you're reducing the risk of them capturing COVID-19 because they're not on site as often. You might look at that side of it. Customers, you know, can you get them in and out any quicker? You know, let's say, you know, you're going to go to table service rather than them people coming up to the bar. Various ways you can reduce time exposure. Once you've done that and decided what you're going to do, you've got to introduce a safe system of work. And again, if it's high risk, method statements and permits to work. So safe system of work is what it says, and what I call the simple do's, don'ts and always nevers. Easy to understand. You know, you can give that to anybody and they know exactly what they can and can't do for that risk. Then you've got to give people information, instruction and training on what you've decided those controls are, what the risks are to people. People must know what they're dealing with at work. And then, of course, supervision to make sure that people are following the rules that you've put in place. So it won't be any one of those controls. I suspect most things are a collection of many. So information, instruction, training can come in many forms. It's not always formal. You know, it could be on-job training. Instruction can be demonstrating to somebody and asking them to do it back for you. You can use safety signs to reinforce the message, but they need to be in prominent places. One thing about safety signs is they're usually only good for about 3 days because we get used to our environment very, very quickly. Daily briefings as well count as training. And then last on the list is always PPE. But if you decide that PPE is necessary and perhaps you want your staff working in mass because you feel that is the ultimate safety, you would have to demonstrate that you've done a lot of the above as well before you issue out mass. Because PPE relies on people to do it properly. And we see frequently on the news people just wearing the mask over the mouth, which might as well not wear it at all. So that's the official sort of hierarchy of control measures, and you would vary it for depending what the hazard is that you're looking at. Okay. But again, it's a 1 to 6 on that one, 1 to 5 for the risk assessment procedure. Okay. Go home healthy. Record everything. I strongly urge you to record everything. If you've including business owners or directors, there's 5 or less, you don't have to record it, but for COVID-19 I would definitely recommend that you record it. And I think it would be almost inconceivable that you wouldn't make notes of what you've done. Report and investigate near misses, accidents and incidents, and encourage your team to be reporting these as well, no matter how trivial they think it is. So let me just change screens and just show you a risk assessment. Can everyone see that? Unfortunately, I can't see you now, but as long as you can see that, hopefully. So,
I'll just see you, Michelle.
Oh, can you? Oh, right. Let me go back to this. Thank you. Let me have a look. So, share screen. Ah, right. Okay. Right. So let me share. Is that better? Can you see that now, Merrick?
Yeah.
I can see.
Good. Okay, so again, you've got these headings. So hazards, what are the hazards? So I'm not going to go through all these because this is obviously working out quite a big document now, and I'm still adding to it. But I just want to give you an example of what might be included in a COVID-19 risk assessment. So if you look at the hazard, then I've talked about this before, unused water systems and exposure to Legionella. So what is the risk? So the risk is contracting Legionella leading to pneumonia, respiratory failure and possible death. So without any controls, I've done it in that format because this is a generic risk assessment. You might start off at a different risk rating because you've already got a contractor coming in to do that. So your initial risk rating might be different, so don't take too much stock in that. But the control measures to reduce risk and the safe systems of work then. So water systems are checked by qualified and specialist persons before anyone returns to work. That's the ultimate control, isn't it? Certification of non-contaminated water is obtained from specialists to prove negative results. That first one is doing everything that is reasonably practicable. That's your ultimate, we've done it, we've controlled that risk. Or water system is flushed following strict specialist guidelines, and there are some out there, and persons carrying out the flushing must wear P3 mask and rubber gloves that must be discarded after task completion. There's a completed date there, initial signed off, and again you can keep track of this. This is where you're reviewing, and you will have that residual risk. So going back to that form, severity, there still might be a possibility because it's a sneaky thing, Legionella, but the likelihood now is minimal. So we're in the green. Is that all right? Does everybody get that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Oh, good. So I'm not going to go across line by line. I'll just go through then. So I've identified poor air quality due to low or zero air circulation if places have been locked up for coming up for 3 months. Persons bringing COVID into the workplace. So there's if you look there, there's a big list of controls. Now, you might not do all of those, but you should be doing a lot of them. I've mentioned before about stress, anxiety, and depression. So persons working under stress during COVID pandemic, again, there's a list of controls that you can do there. You can cherry pick from those. Traveling to and from work. Now, again, I need to take that out, that optional for wearer, because it's now obligatory, isn't it? It's now mandatory for people to wear, so things have changed. People cycling to work, have you got somewhere for them to change the clothing? What are they going to do with the clothing? Have you got somewhere to leave the footwear as well without it getting in the way or thinking about contamination? People falling ill at work, thinking about the structures and equipment, use of communal areas, that's one that is going to have to be focused on. Staff rooms, toilets, water stations, smoking areas, because we've still got this 2 metre distance rule in place. And general working in and around the place. So risk assessments must be signed, otherwise they don't mean anything. So management need to sign that, or whoever's completed it. And signed off by management, and I've just put that sort of risk rating there so that you can relate to it. It also identifies anything else that needs to be looked at, so I've put a few in there. Okay, hopefully that's helpful. How's that? We're back. That's okay. Right, so let's unmute, ask questions. Anyone got any questions? Okay, first of all, how much of that have you taken in? Because it was I would normally deliver that session in about 3 hours, because we'd do practical exercises and practices as well, and I would send people off to do risk assessments in their own environment. So how feedback from me, how was that?
It was good because
it's helpful just to give those key points.
Yeah, good. Jeff?
Yeah, so it's fine. Most of us use risk assessments anyway. We have to in our normal routine. But you pointed out some of the differences with COVID, so it's useful on that front.
Yeah, good. Any questions?
I think the bit that I'm struggling with when I'm thinking about the return is how far can I trust people to be sensible and make those judgments themselves, and how much do we need to spell it out for them? And what exact lengths do we need to go to? And does there need to be a one-way system around the office, or can we trust people to go, well, he's walking that way, I'll just walk that way? And
I would say not. And that's, I go back to, in these circumstances, put the obvious in place. I think if you can put a one-way system in, put a one-way system in. You know, you don't have to spend a lot of money on it. You can just get your stripy tape and make your own arrows. But there's got to be an initial briefing session, hasn't there, where you will walk people round. You know, this is different, because going back to the human factor, we are creatures of habit. I suspect most people, when they return to their workplace, will return and try and do what they were doing before lockdown, because the brain says, I'm back in this place and this is what I do here. So you've really got to interrupt that thought process and not allow people to get back into those habits. So if you can do that in as many ways as possible. So I mentioned like the restrooms, you know, or if you've got canteens, if you can put a massive sign at eye level on the door of the canteen that stops people, because it's different. Oh, that wasn't there before, but it reminds them. You really want to interrupt the habits of people, because we do. If you go, I don't know, if you go back to a place that's familiar to you, you behave in a certain way. So I would say that would be an obvious thing that you must put in place, and then daily briefings and get people's signatures. You must have people
Conversation I'd
sign
had with
off.
sort of the bit we're in a building with obviously other tenants, and the sort of common areas is where the toilets are. So it's sort of what can we do to make sure that there's only one person in the toilet at a time, and it's we don't want to put locks on the outer doors, because then if somebody comes into trouble in the toilet, then that means they can't get access and those kind of things. So it's just finding that balance really, where you're not taking over one risk with another.
Yes, yeah, and I think, and I've come across this a few times with my clients already, where we've talked this through. From a toilets point of view, if you've got toilets that have got multiple toilets in, and people expect more than one to be able to be in it, as they were before, then you're going to have to introduce a knock and listen system. It's that simple. Knock on the door, anybody in. The other thing that construction are using are door hangers. So each trade is given a door hanger, like you see in hotels, and the sign says this room or this house, if the house building is occupied. So it's a visual block.
Yeah, I think that's what our building management company was suggesting, is that they would give us a sign to hang on the doors, and then I was like, well, we need two, one for males, one for females, and I didn't know whether it was more sensible to have them on, like the sliders on the door for each toilet. Probably maybe be more cost effective. I don't know.
Well, the sliders on the door, you're introducing a contact point. That's the only thing. To me,
and you would be, if each company was issued with one, there would then be an internal, but then I suppose you would have a bit more control over whether it was wiped down, wouldn't you?
yes, yeah, and that brings into another control. What I've introduced for one of my clients is that because they've got limited number of toilets, they have issued every member of staff a pack of wipes, and when they want to go to any of the communal areas, obviously on their own, they have a wipe in their hand, and they use that wipe to use the handle. They use that wipe to press the flush. They use that wipe to turn the tap on. So it's a sanitizing wipe, and they wipe themselves in, if you like, and they wipe themselves out, and they were quite happy with that.
That's exactly what we did when there's a couple of us in the office last week to meet.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we did.
Yeah. Yeah, good. And that's what I'm saying, it's not any one thing, there's a collection of things that you can do to remind people. Any other questions?
What's your take on, I mean, obviously we've got a relatively small bar with only one door in and out. I mean, we can say to people, you must sanitize before you come in. But would a better way be to take the temperature and then not allow them in if the temperature readings in the hazard zone?
I think taking people's temperatures for some people might be a step too invasive, because you're almost distrusting them that they would come out when they had a temperature, even though they might not know. I think it might open up conflict. You're not taking my temperature,
Oh yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. To me, I would rely on the sanitizer outside, and I've said before, nobody can be coming back out now, whether it's shopping or going for a drink, and not know what the basic rules are, because we've had 12 weeks of the instructions. So you're just doing what you're asked to do. And I think if you can get everyone to sanitize properly, and not just a quick wipe, fingertips are the key thing. So maybe put the instructions there as well, visual instructions for people. That will hopefully eliminate them bringing it in the first place. The only other way they can bring it in is by coughing and sneezing. So to me, the sanitizer is a really good thing for everyone.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
But I mean, I would say there's ample evidence during the last few weeks, that there's certain tranche of people, if you like, who aren't taking it seriously, for want of a better term.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've been in places like B&Q and places where they had one-way systems, and they're just ignoring the one-way system. You know, they're going the wrong way. They're not wearing any masks.
Yeah.
Don't socially distance.
And again, this is where this human factor is important. It is important to remember that. And, you know, don't tie yourself in knots with it. As long as you've done all that you possibly can, you know, there's a duty of care on both sides, from the general public towards you as well, and vice versa. If you've only got one door in and one door out, it might be prudent to have somebody with the right characteristics on the door.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what we thought, really.
Yeah.
You know, it's the usual thing. The trade's going to be down and staff costs are going to go up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's a tricky one.
But I think how you, going back to, you've got these different people, and that's why on the risk assessments, it's important to identify who and what characteristics, so the risk takers and those that want to feel safe. So I think if you can look after those people as best you can, that will pay dividends for your business in the future, because you'll leave them with a nice feeling. Hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah. They are difficult circumstances, aren't they? You know, you can just do the best you can. But what I would say is communicate. And Anne-Marie mentioned about shared accommodation. The 3 C's come into it: communication, cooperation, and coordination. You know, if you've got next door businesses, what are they doing? If you end up with a queue, how are you all going to manage your queue so it doesn't merge and you're not clashing? So there must be some communication. So look beyond your own business as well to try and make it work.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions? No, so we're a little bit over, but I'm okay with that.
I've been taking loads of notes.
Oh, good. Well, Paul has said they're going to send out a draft risk assessment, so I suspect it will have the outline, and then you can then walk the land, personalise it to your circumstances. And I think at the moment in particular, the outside space, if you are having to have people queue, because we've got the showers at the moment, thinking how you might manage that as well. So adverse weather was one that I had on the risk assessment, because that is prudent at the moment. Fingers crossed the thunderstorms dissipate and we're back to the sunny weather that will bring more people out. So everyone okay with that?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, good. Glad it was useful. So I'll sign off now. Again, say thank you to everyone. Thanks for taking part.